A 17-year-old princess named Stephanie was married to a prince who would one day become the ruler of a big empire called Austria-Hungary. At first, it seemed like a fairy tale, a young princess marrying into royalty. But soon after the wedding, something terrible happened. Stephanie got very sick. The illness was strange, and it changed her life forever. It hurt her so badly that she couldn't have more children again. People in the city of Vienna started whispering about it. They didn't know what really happened, so they made up stories. Some were dramatic, some were wild, but the truth was even sadder than all the rumors. Stephanie was the daughter of King Leopold II of Belgium, a king known for being very cruel. Her marriage was supposed to bring two powerful families together, but instead, it turned into a nightmare. What happened to Princess Stephanie didn't just hurt her body, it also caused big problems for the royal family and the empire itself. This is the real and heartbreaking story behind her life, a story of pain, secrets, and how one illness changed everything. But this isn't a tale of poisons or exotic diseases. This is about something far more ordinary and far more cruel. It's about how, in the 19th century, sexually transmitted diseases became silent weapons used by powerful men, how aristocrats passed along more than just titles, and how a young princess paid the ultimate price for her husband's recklessness. This is the real story of the infected princess. To understand how Stephanie's tragedy unfolded, we have to go back to where it all began, into the harsh world she was born into. On May 21st, 1864, at the royal castle of Laeken in Belgium, Stephanie Kloot Louise Hermine Marie Charlotte entered the world. Her father, King Leopold II, one of the most controversial rulers in European history. Now, Leopold wasn't just the king of Belgium, he was also the brutal owner of the Congo Free State, a colonial enterprise where millions of African lives were lost in the ruthless pursuit of rubber and ivory. But his cruelty didn't end in Africa. It reached into his own home. He showed no warmth to his daughters, saving all his affection and ambition for his only son, Prince Leopold. Stephanie grew up in a deeply dysfunctional household. Her parents, Leopold and Queen Marie Henriette of Austria, were stuck in a loveless marriage. The king was a serial adulterer. The queen, worn down by his cruelty and infidelity, eventually isolated herself from the court altogether. And while young Stephanie was technically a princess, she wasn't treated like one. She was a pawn, a piece in her father's political chess game. Her education was basic at best. She learned a few languages, some manners, and how to survive the formalities of court life. But when it came to the deeper matters of life, sexuality, intimacy, her own body, she was left completely in the dark. That silence would later cost her dearly. By 1879, Stephanie was only 15, but her father was already making moves to marry her off. For Leopold II, marriage wasn't about love. It was about strategy, and his target, the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire. He began negotiations to marry Stephanie to its crown prince, Rudolf, a 21-year-old man known for his instability, erratic moods, and troubling behavior. In March 1880, Rudolf traveled to Brussels to meet his future bride. Diplomats orchestrated the meeting carefully, presenting it as a moment of romance and destiny, and at least on the surface, Rudolf seemed charmed. In letters to his mother, Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi, he praised Stephanie's looks, her sweetness, and her intelligence. He called her exactly the kind of woman he wanted to marry. What he didn't mention, he was already deeply entangled in a world of brothel, affairs, and dangerous liaison. Rudolf had been living recklessly in Vienna for years, and during one of those escapades, he had contracted Gorrhea, a fact that was carefully hidden during the marriage negotiations. The engagement was officially announced on March 7, 1880, but the wedding hit an embarrassing snag. When Stephanie was sent to Vienna to begin her royal training, something shocking was discovered. She hadn't yet reached puberty, and worse, she had absolutely no knowledge about how reproduction or sex worked. Her ladies-in-waiting were horrified. She was promptly sent back to Belgium, humiliated, confused, and still completely unprepared for adult life. This moment laid bare just how little her parents had done to prepare her for the role she was about to inherit. She was being married off like an object, and no one had bothered to teach her how to live as a woman, let alone as a wife. Eventually, in May of 1881, when Stephanie was 17, the wedding finally took place. The ceremony was held at the Grand St. Augustine's Church in Vienna. It was an opulent affair with royalty from all over Europe in attendance, including the future King Edward III of England and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. From the outside, it looked like the perfect fairy tale. At first, things seemed fine. Stephanie took to her new role as crown princess with enthusiasm. Rudolph, for a while, seemed devoted and affectionate, and in September 1883, they welcomed their only child, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie. There was hope. Maybe this union forged in politics could grow into something more. But behind the palace walls, the cracks were already starting to show. Rudolph hadn't changed. He still visited brothel. He still kept mistresses, and his moods became more unpredictable, swinging from charming and lively to dark and depressive. Then in 1886, disaster struck. Stephanie, just 22, fell ill with a terrifying and painful condition. The truth quickly emerged. Rudolph had infected her with a sexually transmitted disease, most likely Gorrhea, the same illness he'd been carrying before their marriage. Back then, without antibiotics, Gorrhea was a vicious illness, especially for women. It often spread to the reproductive organs, causing chronic pelvic inflammation, excruciating pain, and most tragically, permanent sterility. Stephanie suffered all of it, but the physical agony was only part of the trauma. The emotional devastation was just as brutal. She had trusted her husband. She had borne his child. And now she had to live with the reality that he had destroyed her ability to ever have more children by his own selfish choices. For a royal woman, producing heirs wasn't just tradition, it was a duty, and now that duty was ripped away. Stephanie had given birth to their daughter, but that would be it. Her body would never recover. Her role as dynastic mother was in the eyes of the empire a failure, and Rudolph, he didn't accept any responsibility. Instead, he blamed Stephanie for her inability to produce more children, ignoring entirely that he had caused the very condition that made it impossible. Their relationship unraveled quickly after that. Bitterness crept in, trust evaporated. The word divorce even came up, almost unthinkable in the ultra-conservative Catholic environment of the Austro-Hungarian court. Stephanie, heartbroken and betrayed, began to look elsewhere for affection. During a visit to Galicia, she became romantically involved with a Polish count. Meanwhile, Rudolph spiraled further into self-destruction. His affairs multiplied. He turned to alcohol and drugs, and his mental health deteriorated alarmingly. That dark path would soon reach a tragic end. The darkness that had been steadily growing inside Rudolph reached its climax. On January 30th, 1889, he and a 17-year-old girl named Baroness Mary Vatira were found dead together at the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Meerling. The official story labeled it a suicide pact, an act of despair by two doomed lovers. But whispers of conspiracy and political intrigue followed for decades. For Stephanie, the news was both a shock and a strange kind of relief. She was just 24 years old, an imperial widow, and yet finally free from a marriage that had brought her nothing but pain, betrayal, and humiliation. The loss of her husband was tragic, yes, but the marriage had already been dead for years. With Rudolph gone, the Habsburg line faced a crisis. He had left behind only a daughter, Elizabeth, and no male heir. For an empire obsessed with succession, this was a looming disaster, and all eyes turned back to Stephanie, not with sympathy, but with blame. They blamed her for not producing a male heir. They ignored that her reproductive health had been destroyed by the very man who had taken those hopes from her. No one spoke of the disease. No one mentioned the infection. No one dared challenge the narrative that women were responsible for dynastic failure. And so Stephanie lived on, physically scarred, emotionally wounded, and publicly shamed. Years passed. The empire moved forward without her, and Stephanie, once at the heart of royal life, found herself pushed to the margins. Still young, still intelligent, still with so much life ahead of her, she chose to remarry. In 1900, she married a Hungarian nobleman named Count Elmare Lonier. It was a love match, not a political one, and for once in her life, Stephanie married for herself. But by then, it was too late for more children. The disease had left her permanently infertile, and while she may have found companionship, she never escaped the shadow of what had been taken from her. She lived for decades after Rudolph's death. She witnessed the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She saw her father, Leopold II, pass away. She lived through the horrors of World War I, then World War II. The Europe she had once been born to rule was gone, its palaces crumbling, its monarchs fading into history. Stephanie died on August 23, 1945, at the age of 81. She had outlived both her father and her first husband. She had endured more than half a century of quiet suffering. But even in death, history tried to forget her. To many, she was just the failed wife of a tragic prince, the woman who didn't give the empire a son. But the truth of Stephanie's story runs far deeper and deserves to be remembered, because what happened to her wasn't just bad luck or romantic tragedy. It was part of a broader systemic injustice. In the 19th century, sexually transmitted diseases weren't just personal health issues. They were social weapons, and aristocratic women like Stephanie were the casualties. Their husbands, often far more sexually experienced, often careless or cruel, brought disease into the marriage bed. And when the consequences came, infertility, pain, medical ruin, the women were the ones blamed, always. Medical records from the time show this wasn't rare. In fact, it was tragically common. Upper-class men, shielded by privilege and ignorance, infected their wives at alarming rates. And the solution society chose? Silence, shame, and scapegoating. Stephanie's case is one of the few we know about in detail, but it was far from unique. Princesses, duchesses, noble women across Europe, many suffered the same fate, afflicted by the very men they were forced to marry, then blamed for failing to fulfill their purpose. And here lies the real scandal, not in what happened at Meerling, not in the rumors of poisons or assassination plots. The real scandal is in how women like Stephanie were sacrificed to maintain a system that cared more for dynasties than human lives. Stephanie had no say in her marriage. She was kept ignorant of the most basic facts about her body. She was infected by her husband, blamed for the consequences, and tossed aside when she could no longer serve her function. Even her one child, Elizabeth, would go on to carry the legacy forward, marrying and producing descendants who ensured the Habsburg name lived on. Ironically, the disease that robbed Stephanie of more children didn't end the dynasty. It simply narrowed it to a single, fragile line. And yet, no one thanked her. No one recognized her endurance. No one honored her pain. But we can, because Stephanie's story, painful as it is, tells us something vital about power, gender, and accountability. It reminds us that behind the opulence of royal courts were real people, women who suffered in silence, blamed for sins that weren't their own. And perhaps more importantly, it forces us to question the systems, both past and present, that allow such injustices to happen. The patriarchy didn't just ruin lives. It made sure those ruined lives were never spoken of again. The infected princess was not a villain. She was a victim of a system that protected male privilege at every turn and left women to carry the burden in silence. Stephanie's story may be over, but its echoes are loud even now. Think about it. This wasn't some ancient myth or fairy tale. This happened in palaces not far from the ones that still stand today. Behind velvet curtains and grand chandeliers, powerful men made decisions that shattered lives and then walked away from the consequences. Stephanie was infected not by foreign enemies, nor by a rare plague, but by her own husband, a man she was forced to marry, a man who had already betrayed her before they even said, "I do." She was never told the truth. She was never given a choice. And when her body paid the price, society turned its back on her. That's the most haunting part of her story. Not the scandal, not the disease, but the silence. The silence of doctors who knew what was happening to women like her, but said nothing. The silence of fathers who saw daughters as political chips. The silence of a world that pretended aristocratic women were protected, when in reality they were disposable, and that silence lasted for generations. It wasn't just Stephanie. Throughout Europe in the 1800s, princesses and noblewomen were routinely married off with no understanding of sex, no protection from disease, and no control over their own bodies. When infections came, as they often did, no one looked to the source. Instead, blame was placed squarely on the women. You can't have children. You must be the problem. You're in constant pain, hysteria, weakness, imagination. This wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate cruelty disguised as custom, a calculated refusal to educate women about their own health, because knowledge, after all, meant power, and powerful women threatened the balance of dynastic control. Stephanie was born into this world, groomed to serve, not to live, used for alliances, then discarded when she could no longer produce. She was one of many, but her story survives because of the brutality of its ending and the strength of her survival afterward. Even after Rudolph's death, even after the humiliation and the loss, she didn't disappear. She didn't go mad or fade quietly into some rural convent as many expected her to. She rebuilt a life. She remarried. She chose love over duty. It may not have erased the scars, but it showed something powerful. She refused to be defined solely by what had been done to her. Still, history rarely honors women like Stephanie. She is a footnote in Habsburg history, a side note to a prince's fall, a name attached to a scandal no one wants to fully explain. But her life, her real life, holds far more weight than any fairy tale, wedding, or marling mystery. It tells us what happens when you deny young women knowledge of their own bodies. It tells us what happens when power protects irresponsibility. It tells us what happens when silence becomes the only answer offered to a woman in pain. And it warns us that these patterns aren't just relics of the past. They evolve, they persist, and unless confronted, they repeat. Stephanie's body was a battlefield in a quiet, hidden war where medical truths were buried and women paid with their health, their fertility, and their dignity. She wasn't just collateral damage in a failed marriage. She was the consequence of a culture that saw women as means to an end, nothing more. She lived through it, she endured it, but she should never have had to. Today we tell her story, not for shock value or pity, but for truth, to acknowledge the injustice, to name it, to say out loud what the salons of Vienna only dared whisper. Stephanie of Belgium was not weak. She was betrayed. She was failed. And she deserves to be remembered, not just as a tragic princess, but as a survivor of a system that devoured countless women like her. Her tale ends in 1945, in a world unrecognizable from the one she was born into. She saw empires fall, wars, rage, and history rewritten, but her own history that remained buried in shame and silence until now, because this is the truth behind the myth of the infected princess. Not a story of mystery, not a tale of treachery, but a brutal, ordinary, devastating truth about what happens when privilege, power, and patriarchy collide, leaving women to bleed quietly behind palace walls.